Tonal harmony courses normally talk about modulation, but there's no mention of it in other musical styles. Tonal modulation requires an audible tonal center, and that requires a scale with unequal steps. This is because scales with entirely equal steps, like the chromatic scale or the whole tone scale, can't have any sense of tonal finality. Of course, one can create punctuation and direction with rhythm and other musical dimensions, but in this lesson I want to focus on pitch relationships. Let's compare two phrases with the same rhythm. Here they are. Our first example here uses only notes within this 6-note scale. The second phrase uses all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. Which of the two phrases has a clearer character? The first one. Why? Limiting it to certain pitches and avoiding others gives it a kind of tonal focus that's lacking in the second one. Again, I could have made the second phrase more memorable with, say, a rhythmic motive, but in terms of pitch alone, the second phrase simply contains too much information in a very short time for the listener to retain. Perhaps this is the reason why folk melodies are never 12-tone chromatic. At any rate, my point here is that if you're aiming at a memorable, characteristic style, pitch and/or interval limitations are a strong way to achieve it. Of course, pitch limitations don't preclude transpositions or even adding other notes. Listen to this. These two phrases use the same notes, except for the B, which is marked by the X. This new note adds a bit of variety, but the overall character is quite consistent. Now here's the same first phrase, but with a different second phrase. We definitely sense more contrast here. There are more new notes, again marked with X's. Now listen to this. Here I've added the same new pitches in the previous example, but they arrive much sooner, making the perceived contrast more emphatic. Just as in tonal modulation, we can measure the difference between two keys by the number of accidentals that change. Here, the number of new notes is a good indicator of how much tonal novelty the phrase contains, and the speed at which they arrive lets the composer control the intensity of the contrast. In the classical tonal repertoire, the development section of a sonata form normally modulates more and farther than the exposition. This helps create formal contrast between the relative harmonic stability of the exposition and the development harmonically more stable. Then, when the recapitulation arrives, a sense of relative stability returns. This kind of control, which is only possible when there are pitch limitations in a musical idea, is a very powerful tool. Composers in any style need variety and contrast in varying degrees. This simple idea of measuring the amount of novelty and the speed at which the new notes arrive allows the composer to control these things in a very refined way, and it's very audible. An interesting question. Are the above examples tonal or atonal? By its very nature, atonality is a way of describing music in terms of what's absent. This is why I prefer to think of tonality and atonality as being on a continuum, not as black and white. And here again, being able to nuance the degree of tonality is much more useful to the composer than just avoiding any semblance of tonality. Two composers who use this technique in a very expressive way are Bartók and Shostakovich. Neither one writes tonal music in the sense that Mozart did, but they both use pitch limitations, often by scales and modes, as a tool for creating clear, strong character. And both composers have pieces where some sections have a clear tonal center and others don't. But even in the sections that don't have a clear tonal center, the chromaticism is never simply unlimited and gray. Here are two examples of their music displaying this kind of tonal richness. Shostakovich's 15th Symphony, the last movement, and the first movement of Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra. The student can learn a lot from these two examples.